I'd like to introduce Vinay. Vinay is a Sydney-based writer and finance professional. He started working at Westpac, and then he became the head of private capital at the Commonwealth Bank. And then he worked at Rubicon Asset Management for a few years as a chief investment officer. He's also a screenwriter as well, who's written a book called The Frankenstein Candidate. And today, Vinay will be talking about the GFC, and it'll be quite a different interpretation of what caused the crisis than what you'll typically hear on the media. The media and mainstream economists tend to blame the lack of regulation, the free market as the problems that led to excessive lending and borrowing. But Vinay will argue the opposite, that it was a lack of a free market and too much regulation which actually caused it rather than try to stop it. So I'd like to introduce Vinay now.
Thank you, Michael, for the very complimentary introduction. What we're going to talk about today, you may or may not have heard this interpretation. Because the popular media focuses on the interpretation that we'll just briefly go through very quickly in the beginning. And so I'm not going to push this down your throat and try to convince you that this is the only way to look at things. Okay? I'm going to say, well, this is one way to look at it. And if you are serious about cultivating a critical mind, and keep an open mind, look at some of the recommended reading at the end of this presentation, and make up your own mind. That's where we're going. The popular media has blamed derivatives, especially credit default derivatives, securitization, those greedy Wall Street bankers. They caused the global financial crisis. And we'll do a very quick experiment right now, right here. Okay. Here's Michael, there's Mark, where's Jason? Jason's run away already. Okay. It's Carol, isn't it? Okay. So Michael's a smart guy, right? What he's done, he's taken a wager, a bet with Mark for just $10, saying it'll rain tomorrow. He says it'll rain, he says it won't rain. And then he takes a bet with Carol saying it won't rain. And he's kind of perfectly hedged. It doesn't matter whether it rains or it doesn't rain, he doesn't make any money. But then he gets greedy. He says, this is good. They don't know each other. And he kind of leverages it up and he says $50,000. He's got money, he's got a rich dad, don't worry. So he says $50,000 to Mark. If it rains, Mark's got to give him $50,000. If it doesn't rain, he's got to give Mark $49,000. And Mark says, hey, wait a minute. He says, oh no, that's the probability of precipitation is blah, blah, blah. That's why they're not equal. And then he says to Carol, if it doesn't rain, he gets $49,000 from her. If it does rain, he gives her $50,000. Right? So the next day comes and goes. We have some definition of rain, minimum precipitation of 2 millimeters or whatever. And he's set to get $1,000 profit no matter what happens. Right? He's perfectly hedged. He has his arbitrage. But there's one snag there. And the snag is, if it doesn't rain, Mark has to pay him. And Mark says, ha, I fooled you. I don't have 50 grand. And he's got, because he had 50 grand, he's got to pay Carol now. But in this whole process, when we exchange $10 and when we exchange even $50,000, the total amount of cash in this room didn't change. Neither did if you had a certain amount of wealth in an economy. And by wealth, I mean assets, productive assets, even including ships and planes and machines. Nothing's been bombed out of existence. So wealth hasn't changed simply because people took bets with each other. That's what they are. Derivatives are wagers on exogenous events. And yes, they can get very, very complex. I put LTCM question mark there. and which is kind of, it wasn't quite counterparty credit risk in LTCM, but LTCM was long-term capital management. And in 1998, the Federal Reserve of the US decided to have a meeting with all the bankers and LTCM and try and rescue LTCM. But the Fed didn't actually contribute to the rescue. And if no wealth can be lost by derivatives, why did they do it is the question. LTCM had some what they call convergence trades. So they would buy, for those of you who are familiar with finance, they'd buy a 30-year bond, treasury bond, which had been issued 3 months prior. So it was 29 years and 9 months to go. They would short a 30-year bond, which had more liquidity, and then pick up the spread. They'd protect themselves from, like Michael had, from interest rate fluctuations, leverage it up. It was a 4.75 billion in equity. They had leverage of 125 billion on top of that. The total trades in notional amount were $1 trillion. So the Federal Reserve was scared because they were playing in government bond markets. They were scared because banks like Michael were on the counterparty side, so that if they wound up without paying, it would be the banks that would lose money. So the regulators are scared if banks lose money to hedge funds. But if hedge funds lose money, they're not scared. There's no diminution of wealth in the economy, but that's why they're scared. So let's just keep that in mind when we go toward the end. So that was a bit of a sidebar in that derivatives have taken the blame, but I think we can exonerate them from, and securitization as well, we can exonerate it from being the primary culprit for a massive failure in the economy. So now we're on to what really caused it. Okay. This was first enacted in 1977, modified in 1995 under Bill Clinton. Community Reinvestment Act. There was a little study done by the Boston Fed that said, you know, when these people come for home loans, Asians get better loans than, more often Asians get approved than whites, but whites get approved more than Hispanics or African Americans or Hispanic Americans. And there was, as you can imagine, a lot of uproar. Then there was a subsequent study which said if you modify that for credit worthiness, the second part is not correct. But it was lost. The liberal media was on top of it. Bill Clinton and the whole lobby was on top of it. And they strengthened the Community Reinvestment Act. They reinvigorated the other credit acts. Boston Fed wrote a manual for the banks and exposed the banks to some very crushing discrimination lawsuits unless they were giving home loans to the people who were missing out, the minorities, never mind their credit worthiness. So that was a big stick for the banks. What happened then was we also needed a carrot. The regulators were at the door, give more home loans to certain people. By the way, the fact that one minority, being the sort of Asian minority, was getting more home loans than whites because they were more credit worthy, they were more regular in their payments, was lost obviously on the liberal media. So you might have heard these names, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Fannie it's called an association, but both Fannie and Freddie are corporatized entities. They're corporations that were owned by the government to start with, and then they were later privatized, and now they sit under what they call conservatorship, which is nationalization. They're owned by the government again. And they didn't give mortgages directly, but what banks were able to do is to write the mortgage and sell it to Fannie or Freddie. So the banks had a little party going on. Their capital wasn't running out. They could keep on writing mortgages. Generally they didn't sell individual mortgages. They bundled them up, called it a CDO, sold the CDO securities to Fannie and Freddie. And Fannie and Freddie too, the investment banks were helping them securitize their mortgages as well. And so they weren't running out of capital. They had a $2.25 billion line of credit from Treasury. They were listed on the stock exchange. So seemingly there was just infinite capital to go around. And the New York Times was writing an article exhorting people, go and buy a home. It's the American dream. There's a case study of a guy who was a student making $17,000 a year, mid-20s, was married. There's no right, he shouldn't have got a loan in the kind of suburb he did. And when the collapse came, after the collapse, they said from 1995 to 2008 of the new mortgages, Fannie and Freddie had a hand in 75% of them. Half of the mortgages, they had a, when I say they had a hand in, they weren't still in their balance sheet because some of them was kind of, they had gone through Fannie and Freddie and then been sold to some Norwegian fund up, like or an Australian superannuation fund or something like that. But Fannie and Freddie had facilitated that many mortgages. They also said Fannie was, excuse the French, sucking up to Bill Clinton. Well, turns out that Fannie Mae made a lot of campaign contributions to Bill Clinton as well. So now the banks were really in a good position, right? They're making fees from originating mortgages, and if they didn't originate, they had a stick over them. Meanwhile, they could sell the mortgages, make a lot of money, and making a lot of fees. Fannie and Freddie are making a lot of money as well. The only thing that was needed to ignite this party was the central bank, and they got into the act. You sort of often hear that the central bank lowered interest rates. That's the sort of popular thing that the media reports. And what actually happens is that it's not that straightforward that someone writes on the blackboard, well, we'll make this 3.25% 3%. I mean, there is a refinancing rate with the banks that they can just change pretty much like that. But the other thing they do is they go into the market and with their authorized dealers, they put a lot of demand for treasuries with money they don't really have. They just create the money out of thin air, write it as an accounting entry and say basically to their authorized dealers, which will be big banks, over here the CBAs, the Westpacs, over there the JP Morgans, the Goldman Sachs, they're all authorized money market dealers and treasury dealers. And there's a little bit of an auction, a little bit of a competition in terms of getting it at the best possible yield. But once the bank knows that the Fed is going to buy the treasuries off them at a certain price, then they go out in the market and buy them. So in effect, there is a greater demand. Greater demand means bigger price. And in a bond instrument, as you know, bigger price means a lesser yield to maturity. Does that make sense? Yeah. So once that party began, I was just going to sort of do like a little diversion into the Austrian theory of business cycles. So there's a school of economics that is simply often just not taught. I mean, I did a master's in finance at New South Wales, and Austrian school was never even mentioned. I mentioned the classical, the neoclassical, the Keynesian, the neo-Keynesian, the monetarist, but nobody talks as if it doesn't exist, as if it has no kind of scientific validity, it's kind of witchcraft, or it's just not worth taking seriously as the attitude of the mainstream economists. The Austrian theory is that if you have these sort of consumer fetishes like home lending, or, fed by the government, money gets channeled into consumer items, and the resources of an economy are limited. You cannot cheat nature. You cannot cheat reality. You cannot create assets out of thin air. So if you pour money into the national broadband network, as Kevin Rudd wanted us to do, there's some other jobs that don't happen. There's some other projects that don't happen. And you never hear about them. It's called the broken window fallacy. And there's an argument as to why it's called the broken window, which I won't go into right now. But anytime you hear a politician saying, I'm going to create this new road, new cancer hospital, new whatever, they can print money and do it, or they can borrow money and do it, or what they do is some other project won't happen because they're doing it. If they're printing money and doing it, everything else is going to become more expensive eventually. If they're borrowing money and doing it, at some stage or the other, the borrowing would have to be returned, so it's borrowed from future generations. So the older generations literally borrowing money from the younger generation like you. So even one of the Fed board members, his name is Thomas Honig. If you go through the minutes of the Federal Reserve meetings, Honig always dissents. He says, no, we shouldn't be doing this. Yet today he's sitting on the board of the FDIC, which is an insurance company that guarantees bank deposits. His salary is twice that of Ben Bernanke's. Bernanke gets just under $200,000 a year. Our APRA chief gets $1 million a year. But the real, the real attraction of that Federal Reserve chief job is once Bernanke finishes in 2014, he'll be the after dinner speaker everywhere and anywhere, and pretty much draw, $10,000 for one speech, that sort of money, consultant to the government. He'll go on to K Street, become a lobbyist, earn millions quite easily. So that's one of the big attractions of becoming the Fed chief. O'Driscoll was a Fed official who said the Fed is like the arsonist. So they've set the fire. They really got the fire going by pumping money into the economy. And then they watch, oh my God, I can't believe I did this kind of thing. In addition to that, there's a lot of legal distortions in the economy. This is happening here as well. We get this first home buyer scheme, free land, new roads. This is happening here. Wayne Swan, right now, here and today, has a scheme of building extra housing. It's called emergency housing scheme or something like that. Extra housing for people who work in emergency services. So at the moment, it's fairly limited, and you'd say, well, is it a bad idea to give policemen and nurses some kind of cheaper housing? Well, yes and no. Why don't they just raise their salary or something? Because you could have some policemen or some nurses who are married to surgeons and don't need that cheap rental. The additional problem in the US, which still is the home mortgage interest deduction, is tax deductible. And for many middle class families, it's the largest deduction there is. So unfortunately, even George Bush, who's a Republican, was also on the same bandwagon as Clinton. Buy a home loan now. He persuaded the regulators to try and get the down payment to zero. So you get 100% loan if you have no job, practically no income. And house prices in the United States were rising continuously from 1998 till 2006. So you got to ask the question, why did the bubble not burst earlier? And while the Fed was pumping money and the house prices were rising, there were a lot of borrowers who couldn't pay because they didn't have a job, they didn't have income, they couldn't pay their interest a couple of years later. Part of the problem was there were lots of adjustable rate mortgages that we see here. The first year the rate is 1%, next year it's 5%. When it's 1%, they can pay. Next year when it's 5%, they find the house is going up 20% because that's how fast prices are going up. So they flip the house. They either refinance and get it down to 1% again, or they sell it. They actually make a capital gain for not being able to make their interest payments. The bank's happy, they got their money back, start all over again. It's like, it keeps escalating. Obviously, at some stage, if we did this in our little island economy, Michael was the banker, then at some stage, and if we sort of persuaded everyone, build more huts, for some of us got to go and hunt for food, right? So, okay, instead of 10 out of 100 people doing huts for everyone, we'll have 50 out of 100 people doing huts. Soon, we'll have too many huts. It's just the law of nature. And we'll have insufficient medical care, we'll probably have insufficient food, we'll have insufficient everything else. So that's exactly what happened. There were just too many houses. And the house prices have to collapse. But that in itself doesn't explain why there was a credit crisis. The credit crisis is explained as follows. Even though the banks were selling the mortgages off, typically when you do a mortgage, you couldn't just sell it off. They were sold in what we call CDOs, credit default obligations. So you had to keep writing new mortgages for about 6 months, build it up till it was $300-400 million. 500 was the ideal number. By the time you had 100, you were going to the rating agencies and trying to structure it. And then when the package was finally ready, you would contact some investment banks, you would go to Fannie and Freddie, eventually sell it off. So anytime the party stops, anytime the music stops, you have something left over in your balance sheet. All those things that were, the sausage was being prepared before it was sold. So they did kind of get caught with their pants down. They had some left over there. Fannie and Freddie had a lot left over there. Some of the CDOs were sold with what we call the bottom tranche of the CDO, was unrated, could not be sold, so they took the worst kind of risk that can be taken. And at the same time, these banks are extremely poorly capitalized. I mean, if you were an analyst for BHP and you said it's okay for BHP to have 2% equity capital and 98% debt, you'd be laughed off the roof. And you'd think, oh well, Basel III has increased the equity requirement for banks from pure equity capital to 4.5%. I mean, if you said that for Woolworths, IBM, or anything other than a bank, you'd be laughed off. It just doesn't work. Most companies would operate between 40 to 60% leverage. Only banks operate with 90 to 95% leverage. The slither of equity supporting everything is very, very thin. And again, there is a reason for that being the central bank wants them to be that way so they can kind of use their what we call money multiplier. I'll come to that later on, but the problem of having such little equity buffer is that when there are problems like they were, most of them were insolvent very quickly. And the danger was that nobody knew who was insolvent. So Citibank wouldn't trade with JP Morgan, JP Morgan wouldn't trade with Merrill Lynch, and so on. And that's why the interbank market froze, because there's an enormous amount of activity every day on the interbank market. A lot is dealt with on the overnight settlements, in swaps, in derivatives, in government securities, buying and selling going on all the time. And it is on credit, sometimes on 90 days credit, 2 days credit. Now, if you don't know Mark's going to default, you don't want to take a 50 grand bet with him. So when that problem arose in October 2008, the candidates at the time, John McCain, Barack Obama, were summoned to the White House by George W. Bush. He said, I don't know what to do. What do you guys want to do? You agree something. McCain just sat on the fence the whole time. Obama said, I'll support this. This has got to be done. Because he thought that stimulus would rescue the economy. He didn't want to inherit a bad economy. The bailout, first time, wasn't passed. The Republicans opposed it because McCain was still sitting on the fence. They said, you're our leader, you tell us what are you going to do? And then we'll follow you. And then eventually it was passed, unfortunately. Henry Paulson, ex-chief of Goldman Sachs, was Treasury Secretary. He summoned, he had a lot of rescue meetings. There's a story which is not on the slide about one of those rescue meetings. Lehman Brothers, their chairman Richard Fuld, he got something like $300 million payouts or even more. He was in Asia and he was summoned to a meeting in Washington, D.C. And he had his private jet plane. And the first thing he said was, if you want me to get there quickly, can I fly over Russia? And they said, no, you can't fly over Russia. There's no fly zone there. See, he wanted the government, even then, this company of 135 years possibly going down the drain, he wanted the government to grant him a favor. He wanted Treasury to contact Department of Defense to get permission from the Russians so his plane could fly over Russian airspace. Now, thankfully, they said no to that, but there's a lot of cronyism going on, or was going on. Inevitably, this part of it, Bear Stearns was sort of bailed out. The creditors were bailed out, really. Equity shares in Bear Stearns went from $150 to $2 in a matter of days. So the equity holders lost a lot of money. AIG was rescued, so it was a bit of a lottery. Who's going to get rescued? Who's going to get bailed out? Who's going to go to ground? Lehman's went to ground. Ironically, Lehman's went to ground, went to Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and some of its divisions which were purchased by Nomura and others have eventually been turned around into profitable entities. So if you let the market work, things will be set right, which is, if you heard the speech today, the debate today between Romney and Obama, there was a comment about the auto bailout, and Romney's comment was, well, with the auto industry, let it go through a Chapter 11, it'll come out and start functioning again. Keep them operating, as against bailing them out for credit. Bush was called Comrade. Comrade Bush is to the left of me now, is a famous phrase. But since then, if with all this stimulus, the economy, neither the global nor the US, has recovered. And what's happened is the Federal Reserve is still buying treasuries. The interest rates are going further and further down. They're also buying mortgages. And there's new provisions on the Act now. And some of the new provisions are very, very startling. One of them is called the Homeowners Lending Scheme, in which what happens is, if you are deemed to be sufficiently poor, then your mortgage can be halved. So if you're a husband and wife team, and your aggregate income is $65,000, you don't qualify. But you say to your wife, you know what, can you quit your job and then take it again in 3 months' time? Or wife might say that to the husband, can you quit a job, get it back in 3 months' time? Can you negotiate that? If you can, we can show our income is below $35,000. Cut our mortgage in half. Why pay? Even today, this is happening. If you're really poor, you can walk away without even a delinquency score on your credit sheet. So it's still going on. The Federal Reserve is buying mortgages, which is very, very dangerous. I mean, they've already suspected to have got already $5 trillion of treasuries, as in debt issued by the US government. And then on top of that, they're propping up assets. The FDIC is a separate body in the US, the Federal Deposit Insurance Commission. They're dealing at the moment with 4 to 5 bank failures every month. Go to www.fdic.gov, don't take my word for it, look at the past 18 months. 4 to 5 bank failures every month. August was a good month, September was a good month, July was 8 failures. They don't call them failures, just read between the lines. They say, oh, this bank's deposits were taken over by some other bank. So they got pushed into that. 92 failures. I mean, it is under the heading failures, and they're not being too coy about it. 92 failures in 2011. Yeah, that's about 7 or 8 a month. So we then come to what we probably haven't heard. Why does this happen? Why did the Great Depression happen? Why was there a recession in 1991 and so on and so forth? And here in Australia as well. And not only Austrian, but even classical theory says, essentially government creates distortions. And the minute the government creates distortions, it channels production into places where the consumer demand doesn't exist. You can do it by regulation, by tax breaks, price fixing, subsidies, penalties, all that sort of thing. At the same time, you have this bank, which is like Reserve Bank of Australia, APRA, Bank of England, Federal Reserve, whatever they're called. And they've got this very holy kind of presence in our economy. Nobody, no mainstream journalist ever takes them on, other than by saying, oh, maybe they shouldn't have reduced interest rates by 0.25% or something. But in effect, they're nothing but counterfeiters. I mean, if every one of us had a printing press, we'd just print money, and we think we'd all be rich, but in effect, everyone will be poor. Because you cannot create more goods and services by printing money. So if everybody got $1 million stash in front of their house tomorrow, because Ben Bernanke went around in a helicopter and dropped $1 million like that, or everybody gets $1 million, all the prices would go up and none of us would be better off. So there's all this manipulation of money supply, the bastardization of interest rates, and it's not called that. It's just called something else. It's euphemistically called monetary policy or fiscal policy. It isn't policy. So the question then we have to ask is why? Why do they do this? What's in it for them? And we'll get that into the next slide as to what's in it for them. But just before we jump onto that, the talk going around right now is there should be more regulation. And everything that happened was banks were so unregulated and the Wall Street greed and so on and so forth. And we had a Glass-Steagall Act in the US for something like 66 years, which separated investment and commercial banking. Maybe that act should come back. But frankly, both commercial and investment banks took the bait. It was too tempting. There was a carrot and the stick. They all went down together. So that doesn't work. Sarbanes-Oxley is another regulation that reportedly had $3.5 million of regulatory cost. Now, here's the clue to those FDIC failures that you see. Small banks that have about $100 to $300 million in deposits are the ones that are failing. And they're failing because the regulatory cost is a fixed cost. If you have to do a lot of reports and it costs you $3 million every year to do them, who do you think can easily afford it? JP Morgan or the little credit society? If it's the same cost, it's not proportional to your deposit base. The little bank can't afford it. I mean, 3 million is like the entire net revenue. That's how they exist. So they're gone. There's Basel III, and this is an interesting thing. Basel III is now trying to substantially increase. It's still going to be absolutely insufficient, but they're going to substantially increase the capital requirements from something like 8, what they call capital, which includes Tier 1, Tier 2, not pure equity. We spoke about that 2% going to 4.5% before, with mandatory buffers and all that. It still doesn't meet this sort of smell standard. You still would not take somebody like a Woolworth CFO seriously if they said, well, we're going to increase our capital to 15% and 85% debt. No way. It just wouldn't work. You won't be able to list even. In Singapore, you cannot list a company which has debt more than 50%. This is the beauty. Dodd-Frank. Did you hear the first debate between Romney and Obama, and in which Romney said, I support Dodd-Frank too. I mean, that's a terrible thing to say. But I don't like the too big to fail provision. The Dodd-Frank Act is the longest piece of financial legislation ever enacted on earth. 2,300 pages long. If some of you are doing law, I mean, there's 16 titles. It's a nightmare, except for certain kind of people. It's not a nightmare for the attorneys, and it's not a nightmare for K Street. K Street is a metronym. Even today, the 20 largest lobbying firms in the US are headquartered on K Street. It's like Hollywood, except Hollywood is kind of funny now because Universal Studios, Warner Brothers, all moved out of Hollywood into Culver City and different places. Top 20 lobbying firms still on K Street North End. So K Street means the lobbying firms, they're thrilled. They recruit former bureaucrats on salaries of between $1 to $2 million a year base salary, and they get bonuses on top of that. Why? They lobby the government, and what happens? Nothing new is ever created out of that lobbying. The lobbying is simply, oh, let's grab this and put it into here. Work for this constituency. It's always Peter robbing Paul. I mean, imagine, for instance, the government said something like that explicitly. All of you can have a free education, no HECS. Isn't that beautiful? We'll do that just for New South Wales. You'd say, yeah, great, fantastic. And this is the way we're going to pay for it. Victorian motorists will have a new tax. We'll call the Victorian motorist tax. So every time they drive on the roads, they got to pay more regio fees and all that sort of thing. We'll collect it from Victoria and spend it on you guys. Everyone here is going, yeah, no HECS, beauty. Obviously, it won't go down so well in Victoria. So if it is very explicit where the cost is, and all that a lobbying firm ever does is takes it from somewhere, puts it into something else. But where you take it from, those people are not told about it. So they're laughing now. There's another rule called the Walker Rule. That won't work either, prohibiting the banks from owning a hedge fund, investing in a hedge fund. Frankly, the hedge funds some of them made quite a lot of money on this credit crisis because they called it right, Paulson and Company. So if some of the banks had ownership or investment in the hedge fund, they probably would have done much better than what they actually did. So that's one alternative. Or you dismantle this whole structure of fiat money, central banking. So no Reserve Bank of Australia, no APRA, no Federal Reserve, free banking. It's a concept you'll have to read up on. And you remove the government from the economy. And there's a question we asked, which I'm going to come to in the last slide, it's just the second last, as to why people do it. And we've got to really understand why. Part of the reason is that some politicians actually are completely misguided in that they really want to serve the public interest, and they really think that this sort of thing works, this pumping the economy with false money and all that sort of thing. And that theory is credited to a gentleman by the name of John Maynard Keynes, I'll give you the Austrian version of Keynes. The Austrian version of Keynes is, in this book, Keynes is demolished and his quack system refuted. The book is Where Keynes Went Wrong, and it lists 12 generic errors that Keynes periodically has in his book. Generic errors like device 1, obscurity. Device 2, misuse of technical language. Device 3, shifting definition. So it's not 12 errors, 12 genes of errors. And yet that is gospel in not only your economics course here, but pretty much all over the world. And so you get all these trained economists who then advise the government. Some point in time, some of them discover that they've been doing the wrong thing all the time, and they have I don't know, they commit suicide or something, or they go take another job. They just carry on, have a nervous breakdown when they are 64, or I don't know. So this is the big fallacy. The economic reign should be in the hands of experts. That was Keynes' real motivation. He was a very cultured guy, he was very clever, he was a mathematician, but in terms of economics, he let his emotions rule the roost. He wanted a certain outcome. He wanted to be surrounded, and his biographer notes that too, he wanted to be surrounded by admiring people, where he could be the chief. Like if you take a philosophy course, one of the reasons Plato was killed was Plato said to the king, philosophers should be kings. So again, he had to take hemlock, because that's not what the king wanted. But that's what Keynes wanted. He wants to be in the center of things. And that's his motivation. As to gold being a barbarous relic, in 1913, the Federal Reserve was established. APRA became effective as RVA pretty close to just after that. Although the act wasn't passed until much later, because Treasury took over the financing. Since that time until now, the US dollar has lost over 95% of its purchasing power. So if you're still in that kind of era, you'd probably buy a hamburger for a few cents. The Aussie dollars have done exactly the same, over 95% loss. Gold has appreciated. So I'll show gold is a barbarous relic, or is it Keynesianism was a barbarous relic? Keynes, I don't want to speak ill of a dead man, he died in 1946, but I think it's Keynesianism which is more the barbarous relic. That was one of his famous things, the paradox of thrift, which means that if you save, then, and if everybody saves when things are bad, the economy goes down. And it just doesn't work. There is no paradox. And we'll just disprove Keynesianism right now, right here, very quickly. Okay? This is the example I'm using, macro magic. The US has, give or take, $3 trillion today in its budget as expenses, $2 trillion in income. $1 trillion deficit during the Obama years. Right? Over 20 million people unemployed. What do? Keynes said, if you have nothing to do, let them dig holes. This is a true quote from Keynes. Let them dig holes and fill them up again. We'll just make work. All right, well, let's just make work. Pay them $25 an hour, 40 hours a week. That's what, 1,000 a week? 52,000 a year. 52 times 20 million. So 1,000 times million is a billion, 50 times 20 gives me another 1,000, that's $1 trillion. The US economy is 14 trillion in GDP, so wow, we got a 7% growth, man, rivaling China. Unemployment down to 0. Why don't they do that? And the reason is, at the bottom of their heart, some of them know that this sort of make-work nonsense simply doesn't work. I mean, this is an extreme example where you dig holes and fill them up again. But let's take the Australian example, the National Broadband Network. If you want to find how much money the government has wasted on your behalf, do the following. Take the National Broadband Network and strip away all the special privileges that have been given to it. Because that transfers wealth from Hutchison Whampoa, Telstra, Optus and all the rest to NBN. So strip that away. Float it or sell it in an auction. It will definitely sell for a fraction of how much of the money they've already spent. It won't sell for 0 because there is broadband cable in the ground, there is the optic fiber, there is design, there is some value, it's just not equal to what was spent. And the reason is simple. Because Kevin Rudd doesn't know, and he could not have possibly known what is the best for Australians. Let the market work it out. And if the market gets it wrong, so be it. They're the ones who lose money. It's not taxpayers' money. So long as it's taxpayers' money, these guys just keep doing that. One more example at an individual level. Let's say you have a certain amount of wealth, and you put 1/3 of your wealth into the shares of a company that just goes bust overnight, like ABC Learning or something. What is your wealth then worth? You've lost basically 1/3 of the wealth of your wealth. There's no other way to look at it. On the other hand, if you invest 1/3 of your wealth and it happens to be a 10-bagger, do you know what a 10-bagger is? It's Peter Lynch term, which a share that goes up 10 times, not 10%, 10 times. So 1/3 of it goes up 10 times, so what is that, 33.3% goes to 333. Assume the remaining 66.7, say 67 stays the same, you got a total of 400, your wealth quadruples. So if you make smart investments, your wealth goes up. And it's the same with the economy. If the economy makes smart investments, the economy flourishes. And to make an investment, you have to have saving. You can't trick the economy and trick the consumption cycle by starting at the consumption end. In a real sense. In an accounting sense, you can. Because, in first year economics, GDP is the sum of private consumption, private investment, government expenditure, plus exports, minus imports. So there's our trick. GDP up by $1 trillion. Just spend. Government spends in China. Not as bad as digging up holes and filling them up, but some of their projects are huge public sector projects that may not, like NBN, have the same value as would be ascribed by the market. So some of that 7 or 8% growth, you got to take with a pinch of salt. Some of it is true. So that's so much common sense. There's no black magic. Yet when you read Keynes and macroeconomics, the normal textbooks, they're all like black magic. Quite a lot of it is like black magic. I was going to jump to the conclusion after the reading, and the reason is I wanted to alert you to a couple of things. One is Mises.org. It's a tremendous site for anyone trying to understand this. A lot of economics is just simple common sense. Nothing more than an average intelligence required. You're all university students, some of you honor students. You would get through that quite easily. Some of the books are complex and technical. Some of the essays are very, very simple. In the last slide, I do give you my email address, and I think you have probably Michael, so you can take a snap of that, but you can also get a copy of the presentation, whoever wants it. So I've actually lined them up in ease. The Mises seminar is something that the Liberty Australia Institute organizes here. It's on the 1st and 2nd of December. I don't think that is free, but there may be a student discount. Check with Michael and Mark if there is. Peter Schiff's book is very, very simple. I mean, he starts out with like an island economy, 2 people, and they will both catch 1 fish a day. So the economy is never going because they need 1 fish a day to survive. Until one guy starts working harder and harder, catches 2 fish a day, and then spends his spare time building a net, capital, saving capital. Once he gets a net, bang, he's catching 20 fish a day. Wow, the economy booms. Now everyone's got spare time. Now you can do something else. You can build huts, you can do some machines. Saving, he saves his time, invests, smart investment, building a net. If it's a bad investment, you're back to square one. If we all were on an island, built a boat to get out of the island, there was a storm, the boat was destroyed, we're back to square one. The investment's got to be good. If the investment's good, more production pays for itself. That says law, in the sense that if you produce something, in the act of producing things, people get money that they then can spend on the goods that are produced in aggregate. And it works. Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, a series of essays that were written in the 60s, is a brilliantly written book. I mean, Ayn Rand is Nothing short of a hypnotically brilliant writer. And I apologize for putting me into that sort of kind of very high caliber of writers, but this is just, Frankenstein Candidate is a novel that helps you understand how the political mind works. Because I think by now you all know where I'm headed with this. The primary culprit are the politicians. Meltdown's also very wonderful book, reads lucidly and quite easily. And then we get into sort of books that are a little bit more complex. Again, not too much so. If you're studying economics, you wouldn't find these hard at all. Henry Hazlitt was a polymath. A polymath is someone who was a genius in many, many spheres, like Leonardo da Vinci. He never went to university, but if he wasn't writing the anti-government stuff or the unconventional stuff, not so anti-government, then he should have been given honorary PhDs by many universities. Frankly, he is absolutely brilliant. So is George Reisman. Chris Leithner is a Canadian guy who lives in Brisbane, and his focus is quite a lot on Australia, so that you might find that interesting. That book is on Kindle under $10. But visit Mises.org, because every book that is available on Amazon, I find is available either cheaper in Mises.org, or you can get it for free in a PDF format, because they want to spread the word. So now we come to our conclusion as to, well, why is this happening? Why are they lying to us? And so the question is, if somebody committed a murder and you are the homicide detective, who is kind of a very obvious answer, who has the most incentive to throw you off the track? If the scene of the crime was not cordoned off and isolated, who has the maximum incentive to throw some oiled rag and some torn shirt with the wrong DNA in there? It's pretty obvious, the murderer does. The politicians don't want you to know this. And they control education, and so they teach us the wrong things. I know it sounds conspiratorial, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but the conclusion for me, at least, was inescapable. I think it is for Michael and Mark as well. You make up your own mind. The most important thing right now is to develop a very, very critical mind. Don't accept what the mainstream media tells you. Don't even take, Mises' word for it, and definitely don't take my word for it and Mark's word for it. Develop a critical thinking faculty, make it more critical, read, make up your own mind. So if you're looking at a murder, who murdered the economy, what was the motive? Why would politicians do that? Because the problem has become too difficult to manage. You cannot set the economy right without going through a depression now. It wouldn't last that long. I mean, one of the comments Mises made of Keynes was that everything that Keynes said was wrong. Everything, except for one statement. And the statement that is attributed to Keynes is, in the long run, we are all dead. A kind of true statement. I actually think even that statement is wrong. Because the context in which Keynes said it was as follows. The context was, there is a depression now. If we wait for the market to correct, in the long run we'd be all dead. That is wrong. And the reason? The market self-corrects between 1 to 3 years. In 1921, there was a depression that lasted for only a year because the government let the market self-correct. In 1929, Hoover followed stimulus and Roosevelt made it worse, and the result was we had an extended depression for about 8 years. So 1 to 3 years, if that's all it takes for the market to self-correct, that is not that long a run. I'd expect everybody in this room to be alive in 3 years. In the long run, if that's the long run, the 3 years out of the 1 to 3, I hope we're not all dead. I hope none of us are dead in 3 years. So why again do the politicians do it? One, as far as the US and Australia are concerned, they can keep on issuing debt, keep on postponing the problem, keep on kicking the can down the road. Because whoever picks up the can is going to lose the election. That's their belief. Some of them honestly believe, mistakenly, that stimulus programs work. And that's our conclusion. It's certainly, we're not saying we can absolve K Street, the lobbyists, and Wall Street of any blame. Central bankers definitely, number 2 in the culprit list, because they ought to know better. Keynesians, yes, of course. But they're kind of secondary to the fact that if the politicians understood and were committed to a free economy, they can dismantle the Federal Reserve, they can dismantle APRA, they can dismantle central banking. They can dismantle lobbying. By making it a free market, lobbying business would go out of business. Because then there would be, the government would have no power to grant favors. If the government has no power to grant favors, why would you employ an ex-politician for $1 million a year to get access to some politician where you can ask for favors? They would have no legal power in a free economy to grant favors. That's pretty much all I had. I think we can exonerate securitization, just bundling things into securities, risk-taking, private equity, hedge funds, all the usual things that are blamed from murdering the economy. Unfortunately, I think the way things are looking, they're looking pretty bad actually, in terms of where the world economy is headed. I hope, the right thing happens by the time we graduate, but it may not happen. But in any event, thank you for listening and paying attention. And I'd like to thank Michael Kong for organising this, as well as Liberty Australia and the unit, and also the Sydney University for providing a forum in which we criticise what they teach you, which is great. Freedom of expression. Freedom of expression is still alive. They're not called First Amendment here, but thankfully that's still going. Thanks a lot.
Thank you everybody for attending today. We're going to have a short Q&A session right now, so if anybody has any questions, just feel free to ask.
Oh, sorry about that. I forgot about that question. It's going to escape. No questions. Can't be right. Was this, let me ask a question. Since nobody has a question, I'll ask a question. Hands up for whom this was something somewhat new that you hadn't heard, at least part of it you hadn't heard before. So I know Mark's heard it, or maybe not, maybe there was something you heard. For whom was it something new that you hadn't heard before? Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, more than half, so sort of hesitant hands. So the rest of you knew this all, you'd heard this before. And you haven't bothered to check it out whether it's true or not, or you already agree. Anyway, go to Mises.org and look at some of these books. Make up your own mind. Okay. Any other question? Yeah?
Do you believe in market failure?
Can you define market failure?
I mean, like, you've said how the pro-capitalist politicians where market can fix itself within 1 year or 3 year max. But what if it doesn't? What if there's a case where it doesn't fix itself?
Well, okay, let me give you the answer on 3 levels. 1, if the market is allowed to fix itself, it's never happened that it never did. So there's no empirical evidence to back that. Secondly, a lot of the Austrian economics is what we call praxeology or axiomatic. Particularly George Reisman and Henry Hazlitt, they just go through logic and prove a situation to you without having to depend on empirical data, if that makes sense. Okay. And the third aspect is governments interfere in markets so much and so often, and we haven't had an economy without central banking, that it's very difficult to say the market, we know it wouldn't have failed if it was allowed to function. But because of the interference, it increases the problem. There's a particular term that the Austrians use, it's called cluster of errors. And what that means is if you have a range of businesses all doing their own thing, relying on price as the main indicator of information. There is no reason why these bunch of people, these various entrepreneurs, big and small and medium-sized businesses, all commit an error at the same time. There is no reason for that kind of astounding correlation. Because they're not even communicating with each other. They're doing their own thing. You're doing plywood boards and someone else building aeroplanes, someone else doing traffic signals, accounting software. You're not even talking to each other. Why is there a cluster of errors? Why does everybody go down? Like in any individual business can make a mistake. No doubt about that. But that's not a market, that's not a systemic market failure. Yeah?
I was looking into an article about HFC recently, and I wonder.
So HFC?
High frequency.
Trading?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I was wondering if this has better of the GFC or has worse off.
No, I mean, as far as I know, high frequency trading did get the blame for the stock market crash. And again, I don't think that was a fair blame. Again, it was a bubble created by loose money that eventually burst. But as far as this credit crisis, it wasn't, the stock market followed the credit crisis. The credit crisis happened first, Lehman went down, interbank market froze, stock market fell. Even the conventional media hasn't blamed high frequency trading. It's not so much high frequency as some of the trading element has inbuilt put options. If you have a put, the way to cover a put is to sell the stock if it's a naked put. And if you put in rules like below a certain level I'll sell, that sort of thing, instead of buy, it's not logical. The correct investment pattern should be I'd buy at a low. But if you had rules that cascade on itself, sometimes you can end up with a particular stock or stocks cascading down. But at that time, the smart guys, private equity and hedge funds, would be picking it up if the fundamentals don't justify it. So high frequency trading, if it causes a problem, it becomes an opportunity for somebody else. It cannot be a problem. Any other questions? No? That's good. Thank you. We'll shut this down.
Vijay will come and just speak with us today.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for everyone for attending.